Well, if you didn't catch it, we'll try to speak up so that the aid for hearing here can help. I know my voice is not often picked up like you said yours was, Carol, so I'll try to do my best. And so don't hesitate to speak loudly. So we'll go ahead and kick off the meeting. This is our third of what we hope is three, and I think it should be, but we're not done with this one yet, but 3 native plant meetings with the 2 commissions and the Urban Forest Advisory Committee. So we'll go down the agenda, starting with a call to order. Our call to order. We're going to handle our public comment after item 3. So if anyone is here for public comment, please fill out a yellow slip and give it to Jennifer. And Jennifer Gates is here and our lead for the city staff. Would you like to start with the roll call?
Sure. So Kelly Hensey. Joy Lyons.
Here.
Kevin Doyle.
Here.
Steve Dalton, absent. Robert. I think roll.
Yes.
Your name for yes.
Yes, I said yes on that one.
All right.
You're
so
next.
I don't see Robert. I don't see Chris Ryan. Susan Sherrod. Susan? Did I get you? Okay. All right. Ari?
Not yet.
Not yet. Christian Adams? Katie Kramer? Present. William Morrison? Carol Parker? Here. Mark O'Connor?
Here.
Robert Switzler? Mark Jenny?
Here.
Turn your name around. Brian Bishop?
Here.
Tony Gurno?
Here.
I already had Carol Parker. And then Carol Wolf.
Good. So what we'll do today is we'll go through a summary of how we've gotten to where we are, just a very quick summary of our last 2 meetings. And what we have done since then is we've tried to coalesce all the input we've received into recommendations. There's a printout of the materials at the front desk there if you'd like to have a copy. We are going to start by talking about where we want to be at the end of this meeting, and then we're going to kind of drill down into some details. And I'll try to guide us through that process so that we are out of here in 2 hours. So it's a big enough commitment of our time. If there's some follow-up things that we need after, I think that's acceptable. Our job is to kind of do this heavy lifting that we've already been doing to get all of our thoughts together and coalesce those into recommendations.
When do you want to start?
The first one, yeah. Well, the summary, I think, I don't know if that's the first or the second. So do you have a copy of this if you want it? Paper copy in front of you. And what we've done in the past meetings is we've talked about what are our objectives? What are our goals? And I like being clear about that and carrying that all the way through so that if we tend to maybe get off into a rabbit hole somewhere, we can really look back at our goals and objectives and see if that's really aligned with what we're trying to achieve here. There's so many opportunities to do great things, but we want to just keep this specific to what we're trying to achieve here. And then we, at our second meeting, all of you came forward with your response to assignments you took on, special assignments like rainwater harvesting. What are native species? How do you know where to put the native species? What kind of education might be needed around the discussion and the programs and the policies of native plants? So without going back to rehash that, that's what we did at the second meeting. That was extremely valuable. Thank you for doing that really important work. So we took that and looked at it in terms of how can we put these together into recommendations? And then what I think is important, and Jennifer is really good at this too, is what do we want to hand to the city next? What is the city going to do with this? So I'd like to start with that, and that's what this document is here. It's a one-page document that kind of summarizes in a high level what we've said we want to do, and then what we will get out of this effort. So I want to go through this to see if you have any questions about it before we drill down into more detail. We talked about a native plant policy and program goals being simple and practical, and we all really supported that. Apply to both public and private property, promote environmental sustainability and resilience, improve habitat and biodiversity, and increase pollinators, improve natural spaces, including linkages, promote community aesthetics and function, educate our community about native plant stewardship and ecology, foster long-term successful native landscapes, codify, follow up, and enforce, and coordinate with the nursery industry. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing like I just read that, but I just want to reflect back on these goals. One thing I want to point out is we talked a little bit about is drought tolerance what one of our objectives are, and you'll see that that's not necessarily here. We do talk about stewardship and ecology and sustainability and resilience, but it's not specifically one of the goals of this program to focus on drought tolerance. So I don't know, any thoughts on these before we kind of launch into our summary? Yes. Sound like what you remember?
Yep.
Yes, Katie.
I guess the drought tolerant aspect could go under the environmental sustainability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It could, but it's not specific. It's kind of more broad.
Okay. Yeah. Do we need to call it out? To guide the policy or not necessarily?
It might not. I think one of the thoughts about that is some of our natives are more riparian, are more drainage way, are more associated with where our waterways are. So drought tolerance in itself might not be a goal that translates across all of natives that we would use. Okay. And yet that would be sustainable for that environment. Yeah, great question, thanks. So Jennifer, do you want to take a moment and talk about develop a native plant policy and develop a native plant program as far as what your thoughts are on how the city will take this information forward, or do you want me to just launch into that?
I can, and then you can.
Okay.
And what I did is I took the bigger document that is the draft recommendations, and basically there were some duplicative efforts within the different tasks or identifications of recommendations within the different tasks. So I took those and basically condensed it into what I felt was the output from all the different tasks. A lot of the details are in here. I just wanted to make it a little bit simpler. The bigger document will help staff moving forward with all the research that you guys have already done with the different sources of information in regards to zones and things like that. I think there was a few follow-up questions that Councilmember Lyons had today, but I think also there's more details that will come later on through the process as a policy is developed and it would be actually introduced and discussed at each of your individual commissions. That being said, the big picture that I got from all the work that you guys did, I didn't want to oversimplify it, so that's also what I want to talk about today, is that I feel like there was two distinct things that came out of all the work that you guys did. One was kind of the written part, which is the policy, the native plant policy. And then the other part was kind of more of a native plant program, not necessarily something that the city would implement, but something that the city could partner with other organizations, and maybe there's another organization that leads it and then the city just participates. That's to be determined, but that's kind of how I saw the two different roles. So the first being the native plant policy. Based on all of the information that you guys have collected and your discussions that you had, that you guys were looking for a policy that would regulate both the preservation of existing native landscapes as well as future landscape improvements on both private and public properties based on native planting zones. And that would include native plant lists. That would be assisted in the curation by external native plant specialists. So staff is obviously, this is not our specialty by any means. And so that would be the need to have actual specialists help curate what that list is. The next would be that you want to see incentives for that preservation of existing native plants and the proactive use of native plants, as well as its maximized use on a landscape. So if we had specific standards that were created, but we could incentivize them to actually have a greater percentage maybe of their landscaping using native plants, especially with the private developments. And then the other is that the policy, any future native plant policy would be incorporated into other existing policies or future policies, such as the stormwater facilities that you discussed in your work, rainwater harvesting that you've discussed, not exactly called out specifically, but also habitat preservation, fire management. There's a lot of different policies or programs that the city already has that maybe there's another discussion around native plants and ESHA habitats and things like that that we already look at. So how to incorporate a native plant policy within those policies. The second being the native plant program. So again, led by community partners, the city could assist with that in some capacity potentially. The idea being that they would coordinate the collaboration between community partners, interest groups in native plants. In front of you, you also see Councilmember Hensy added the land stewards from local indigenous tribes, and then also native plant nurseries. You had noted the need for plant nurseries to be involved in the discussion because of the lack of availability of native plants. Also to provide outreach and education on native plants and to promote the preservation and incorporation. Cities are typically seen as like the heavy hand and maybe can offer incentives. But a lot of sometimes that outreach and education comes best from our partners that are actually doing this in the community. Also, you talked about implementing any kind of training from the identification of native plants within the environment through the maintenance of native plants as they're actually grown within individuals' yards, or even the city's implementation of a native plant policy on their own public property. And then also to implement and highlight model native gardens in the community would also be kind of a celebratory aspect of a native plant program. I talked a little bit about the native plant policy, but the regulations based on what I saw in the document would be, a section on applicability and how that you guys talked about 3 zones, required zone, maybe a hybrid, and then an area where it would just be recommended but not required, that it would apply to both public land and private land differently, and then also potentially by development type itself. You also talked about preservation guidelines around native plants. Also talked about mature trees based on size and maturity. Didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of those details, but we can talk more about that, especially maybe UFAC would get more involved in maybe that identification for preservation. Planting requirements, we talked a little bit about the plant palette or plant list, appropriate size of pots and installation standards, other types of guidance that we can provide individuals that are proposing landscape plans. And then also you noted that you wanted the review and approval of any design plans as well as the installation by a landscape professional or professional that knows about these aspects to make sure that was installed correctly. And then lastly, that the inspection occurs and monitoring occurs with these enforcement standards. And that is my complete summary.
Well, that's a very high level, and I think you've actually done a really good job of capturing all the complex things we talked about. But at this point, we can pause and think about that before we drill down into the details. Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of issues. 2 of them are related, and that under 1A, the that the native plant lists would be curated by external native plant specialists. There's actually a lot of knowledge within the city in terms of the city arborists, in terms of the arborists. There's lots of arborists that work for the Parks Department and also the UFAC. So I think it doesn't necessarily have to be external. I think it was what we had talked about was that it would be a list curated by an outside group. I mean, that
And
it's
I've
not,
got, yeah.
it would not be a specialist, it would be a some sort of,
An existing organization that already keeps the list. It's more than trees, of course. So.
right.
And we do go into a little bit more detail on that next. So we will get into that in a
Okay.
minute, if it's okay if we kind of park that for now and then.
Okay,
drill
and so
down.
then the second one was, that I didn't remember you guys talking about how the native plant program would be led by community partners. And
So,
that seemed odd to me.
yeah, that was probably aligned with a recommendation based on what we heard. By community partners, I'm thinking of like the Nature Collective, who may already have educational programs about native plants. Now, can you think of other community partners that may already have educational programs about native plants? And so we were thinking if it's already out
The
there.
San Diego Botanic Garden does.
Mhm.
Um,
And so that's another good example. So so perhaps it's not
and
led
Mayor-
by,
Mayor
but
Costa has,
collaborated.
Landscape
Okay,
education as well.
that's really good point. And so I think it's fine to add that thought in because I don't think it's so rigid to think they're going to lead it. But I think the idea is that if there's already good examples of educational programs that exist, we should look in that direction and see if there's an opportunity for us to use
Yes,
that.
it's not education, it's leading the program.
Oh, the program itself.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking it was more the education. But good point. It needs to be clarified. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and it's all about getting your thoughts on this and whether it's clear or not. So thank you for that.
And then I have one more question on word choice on 1B, the proactive use of native plants. I have no idea what that is.
Sure, I can reword it. It's like basically using native plants as by your own choice, by your own, instead of being required to do so, you choose to do so.
So it just needs a words.
I think so.
Maybe.
Right. Susan, did you have your hand up?
Well, Jennifer was saying that there are two distinct areas,
Yes.
policy and then program maybe. And I think we need to really focus hard on policy first, nail that down. Programs, those could be developed subsequently, but we want something that's codified. We really want that policy. And I think that should be our primary focus today.
All right.
Nail down the policy, the programs that can be subsequent. And I think we do have a lot of options, for programs help.
That's good input. Thank you. Anything else at this point? Hi, Ari.
Sorry, Mike.
Okay, well, what we're going to do then is we're going to jump into some detail because I think that's probably what you're most interested in. In the detail is where we've tried to coalesce what you've told us. So let us know if we've understood something incorrectly. That's the second document, and Jennifer will bring it up and kind of go through it as we're moving through it. So the first task, which I honestly think is the most difficult, so I hope we don't get stuck on it, but we might. And I think we've got a total of like 7 tasks to talk about, 8 tasks to talk about. But the first task is native plant list discussion, I'm sorry, native plant species and zone recommendations. And so what I heard us say and what I heard us present was that there were some sources out in the world, out in the community, that already were good sources for native plants. I've tried to capture what I understood you put forward in the SD Plant Atlas. which is curated by the Natural History Museum. And then also there's a California Native Plant Society South Coast chapter resource that I've identified, and the Calscape Gardener Planner. Now I looked at all of these, you know better because you're the ones who brought these forward, but I looked at all of these, they seemed complementary. They are a source of native plants. Some of them are more focused on what nurseries are growing native plants. Others might be more specific to something. How do you find a native plant when you're trying to use it in a landscape? How do you know which ones to choose that would be appropriate for that location? So I'll just jump into what I understood that first recommendation would be as far as a native plant list. And you'll see that towards the end of that first paragraph. Use these 3 sources to select native plants which are appropriate to the project and location, and also use these lists to find out which plants are commercially available from different nurseries. So any thoughts on that? Sounds pretty straightforward and what was put forward?
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I, we might be able to put our heads together to come up with 1 or 2 other ones that, and I think several of these actually draw from the same data sets, actually.
They do, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But in slightly different ways. So I think, we can answer this a little bit, but this is really sufficient. So,
What this does is it provides, in my opinion, a very broad list. So it doesn't say no, it just has to be something you find here in Encinitas. So that broadness helps with the simple and practical. And it's not too restricting, so we're not telling people what to do. We're providing resources so they can select from it. And I liked the elegance of that. Hey, Bruce. So the next suggestion under that item is to define, and this is the last paragraph on that first page, define a secondary plant palette. I gave it a name, combined native and adapted, but it could have a better name. I'm certainly not sure that's right, but I understood that the recommendation there was there's a good reason for having a secondary plant palette that has natives, but also expands into plants that are adapted to our region that would meet the same objectives as our goals in supporting stewardship and ecology and biodiversity and increasing pollinators and aesthetics and function and some of the other things we listed in our goals. Does that sound right? Susan? Yes.
Well, my comment about a secondary palette is that we wouldn't have like a nice list like this native plant resource of different collection of groups that already have developed a conclusive list. And so I think, we're not going to say you have to 100% plant natives. I think we can leave it up to people if they want to plant something else in part of their space, they can. I don't know that we want to get into that. And, I think we might want to, on the other hand, though, the county does identify a list of invasives that we would want to say, no way, we don't want to see these particular things that are invasive in Southern California.
Right,
or
we
in San
do,
Diego County.
yeah, we do already have that invasive plant
Yeah.
policy
So-
that we don't.
So I guess I
use.
don't support defining a secondary plant palette because people can already do that anyway. We're not telling them you have to make 100%, natives in your yard,
Yeah, Katie, I think I saw your hand or.
Oh, sorry, I was just adjusting my mask.
Oh, okay, Kevin, did you have a question?
I've looked at this piece and I do want to see a secondary palette, but as we talk about policy versus program, it seems to me that the secondary palette, which would be recommendations, is something for a program that we roll out afterwards. Instead of codifying it into our code saying, these are the secondary adaptive plants you can use, as part of our outreach and enhancement, we can put together a list of these are plants that, Ari and these guys know and love and will actually thrive here.
Mhm.
And people want guidance.
Mhm.
But this one doesn't need to be codified, I don't think.
Okay, good input. Yes, Katie?
Are there maybe some resources for secondary plant health? Ecotone, okay, yeah.
There are, but it's
I'm
less.
gonna need you to
it's less
speak up.
circumscribed.
You need to speak up for me. I can't hear.
She
Okay.
asked if there are these kinds of lists for secondary.
Yeah, it seems like there would be some resources to draw from the secondary plant health.
And so at this point, we really haven't drilled down on the secondary palette. So maybe there are a lot of questions around the table about it. But I'll certainly take more comments if you'd like, but maybe jump onto the next zones, because that's where maybe we think about where we could use these different palettes differently. Okay. Thank you.
And go back to bullet point number 1, simple and practical
Simple and practical.
for the policy.
Yes, yes. So with that in mind, jump to the plant zones, please. And I get your point, Carol. Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask
And-
a question about the zones?
Yes,
Because
please.
I'm not sure if I fully understand. So
Okay.
I apologize. So for the native zone, would that assume, for the areas identified as, the native zone, would that mean that the regulations would require native planting only within that zone?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's the way it looks right now. So you guys let me know. So I'll tell you the way that I try to interpret what I was hearing, and then let's sort it out. Let's talk about how it works best. So on the second page, the recommendations are shown as a native zone, which would be that primary list with native plants. And according to these two maps, which are on the third page, this is where we pull in the multi-species habitat conservation plan that was recommended as a basis for where our primary best habitat exists now. And of course, this is an older map, so there may be some vetting needed. But this is what we have at the city for where the different habitat zones are. So it's an existing, so I think that's simple, it's existing. And so right now, the way I summarized, and it could be completely wrong, so tell me, but is that if you're doing any work in these areas that are identified, it would be a focus on the native plants for that type of zone. And the primary geographic focus zones seem to be, if I've summarized this correctly, there's a coastal strip, there's brackish marshes, lagoons, and there's coastal sage scrub / southern maritime chaparral. I am just, this is not my specific expertise, so the biologists and the specialists around the room can help with this. But it seemed like, okay, simple, we've already got this. But then I was thinking, I did hear a recommendation for a secondary list. And so if there are areas associated with these zones that are already identified, where you already have good habitat, you've got good plant material, but it's adjacent to these areas where you want to fortify, you want to create an edge that helps to protect these preserved areas, these areas we want to really fortify for native use, then you might have an area adjacent that's a secondary plant palette that maybe doesn't go all the way to exotics, but it's complementary to the goals we're trying to achieve and creates an edge and a border to the native plants. That was the rationale behind a secondary zone. And that's why I was saying when I first started talking about this one, this may be a little sticky because I don't know if I've understood it correctly. And then on the left side here with the green circles, Tony provided me with this, which shows, Tony, you might be able to explain it more correctly. It shows.
Each of those little either dots or polygons is an occurrence of a rare listed plant species. So something that's either listed by the state, federally, or recognized through the California Rare Plant Ranking System as threatened, endangered, or rare. And so each of those, and some of them are overlapping, which is why it looks so messy. But the more complicated the green on that map, essentially the higher the density of naturally occurring rare plants already currently.
So you see, I tried to kind of make these about the same scale next to each other. And so you can see some similarities in how we've identified where the nice habitats are and where there's some existing. But there's also some pockets of, well, maybe it does kind of relate. There's some nuances to some detail about where you might actually find some threatened and endangered species not associated with a larger habitat. Is that the right way to maybe interpret that?
What I would say in terms of the relation of these two maps is that the one that's community-based doesn't necessarily have an emphasis on rare plants or rare taxa at all, animals either. So in a certain respect, where there is consistent overlap, you might consider those the most opportune areas to invest in terms of habitat preservation. Because if there's intact vegetation communities that also contain rare plants, those are the sort of sweet spots in terms of existing natural resources.
So I see something and I wanna just talk about this. Just to throw it out there and then certainly open to people's thoughts. So we have some area here and here that looks like it's still some good quality habitat and probably good natives. Maybe it needs preservation, maybe there's some invasives, maybe it's more of a preservation approach. Let's say we're coming in, this is El Camino Real right here. It's a little hard to tell. But say we're coming in as a city and we're thinking about our specific plan along El Camino Real. And we're thinking about it and we're doing an overlay of native plants and maybe a secondary list. In my head, this is like trying to test out what would happen if we decided that this is an area where we want to preserve and then maybe within that area, but also an area near it, we want to say we want native plants or a secondary list. What does that mean then to what happens in those areas as far as how we improve over time, what we do? Now there's be some retail and there's some residential, and we have the opportunity of thinking about a specific plan right now. So what if we look at it in terms of, could there be some sort of conduit, like a linkage for habitat that really could connect some very nice existing areas for native plants? And we look at those as primary areas where we want to focus our attention for either native only plant list or a secondary plant list so that we can reinforce habitat connectivity through Encinitas.
Well, from my point of view, the entire city should have native plants. The entire city, it should blanket it. But the amount maybe would vary with the zoning. The existing zoning, that we already have defines residential or, a higher intensity of residential or agricultural land should be exempt perhaps, would be the only land I would say I would exempt would be agricultural because it's for growing crops. But everything else could have some level, but maybe not the same intensity that these areas that we already have defined as being, inhabited currently by natives. One native tree per every 1,000 square feet of the city might be just a baseline, or one tree for every 2,000 square feet, or whatever we come up with. But something I would like to see personally, a guideline that's easy to look at in terms of, 1 per 1,000 or 2 per 1,000 or 1 per 2,000 or 1 per 3,000 square feet or whatever it is that we come up with. I want something that can be codified, that when a project comes before us, we can look at that project and say, oh, it's a 7,000 square foot parcel. I see here we have to have, 1 native tree for every 2,000 square feet. So, and you can actually, look at that project that comes in, and it's very easy then, rather than having to go through a bunch of, maneuvers to sort of figure out. I just think a blanket policy is simpler. I would like it to be very simple and practical for us and for people doing projects also, you know, her saying, scratching their head and going, okay, should we have natives? Do we need natives? And I love the idea of the list because that's simple too. Oh, here it is, it's on the list, I can use it.
Right, right. And I think certainly that's good input. I think the reason I started with this focus is because I'd like to suggest that what I heard is that there's some areas that are more important for a full native approach, whereas other areas, perhaps you take a less native approach. And I see nodding around the table, so maybe that's a broader way of looking at it.
I think one thing that you might be looking at possibly is have some sort of incentive program for linking native habitats. And I don't know what that would, I can't think of what that would mean actually. I think that also might be a problem for residential areas, because if you're talking about native habitats, you're talking about areas where coyotes can come through, can get set up.
That's
Right.
everywhere.
That's true, I guess, now.
Yeah.
And-
that's very-
And usually it might be associated with a drainage way or something we already have that's, you know,
Yeah.
already a trail system anyway or something. So I think it would vary throughout the city for sure. Sometimes it could just be birds and butterflies. I don't know, that's the way I look at it, which most people are okay with. So there's a lot of details here that we're really not getting into yet, but that's a good, very good comment.
Could I jump in for a moment, Joy?
Yes, Kevin.
Because I'm looking at the maps here and I really like this one. Tony you were the one who brought this in, right? The green one.
That's from the California Natural Diversity.
And it's interesting because we have, we're very densely clustered near our lagoons, where I think there's a spot where, 100% native would be entirely appropriate. I also look at this ridge line running along just west of El Camino Real, where we've got, you can see it on here, we've got a section where we're green and we, right around the community center, we kind of have a gap. We're not really connected. I know there's a trail system there, and I feel that now there's a section where we've got two highly dense areas that, really should have native. It'd be nice to have a zone, if we were to have 100% native, that connected those two.
You make a very good point there, because there is that trail system, then there's the community, Oak Crest Park, there's some threatened and endangered species there, and then, you kind of keep on, and then all of a sudden you're connected.
Now there's a section, and I also very much agree with Susan. I want to see a matrix, and because, this will come in front of us, and having it codified with hard numbers is good. But I do think 100% native is too much. But there are areas where that's what I want to see. And we can just have that on a matrix. If you're in this zone. Now, related to that, we've got these maps. It may be worthwhile to have staff work on a different GIS map, which is just our map, where this is the zone for one, this is the zone for the other. Planning will be able to pop it up and know which zone you're in, just like they know if you're in the hillside overlay bluff zone. So, and I don't know what goes into that entirely. So I might be asking for something really humongous. So I always look over to Jennifer to see if she cringes when I
What's
suggest
expression
it.
on Jennifer's face?
And then we would consider it probably another overlay.
Yeah, cool. That's
But we've
all I
done
had on that
those.
one.
Yes, okay, good thoughts. As far, we can move on, and then of course we can come back, because, we kind of want to get the full picture perhaps and see if what's missing.
So I would like,
Yes, Tony.
I would like to, before we move on beyond that one, propose that there be a little bit more intensive, like scientific vetting of some of the details on these before they would become policy. I'm not intending to advocate for or against the kind of concept as much as the 5,000 to 1,000 or 500 to 1,000 feet, for instance. I don't know that that's.
I just was thinking, what are you thinking when you're thinking secondary? What's your gut say? I mean, I was just
I
trying to capture
understand
what I
that,
heard.
but if we're gonna go forward with something that looks like this, I think that it would be worthwhile to have some more kind of scientific rigor behind that as much as there is such a thing.
Yeah, my comment was going to be very complimentary. I agree, and I think the concept here is right. I think we just need to think about that framework for the designations. And so, just sort of riffing for a second, I think the 3 zones that you've identified could maybe more easily be said as primary zone, secondary zone, and deprioritized zone or something like
Yeah.
that. And it may very well be that the primary zones are the ones that really are preserved, right? They are, mostly really good habitat. These are lagoons. That area just west of El Camino. That's the natural lands associated with ranch. They're not to be developed anyway, but really make that clear. That intermediate zone. Might be lands, within some distance, but we might need to look scientifically, how does that work, right? Are they adjacent, and there, again, that's a policy question of what percentage or what's the spatial arrangement of native plants on those adjacencies, but I think it's about proximity to those really high priority zones. And I think this question of creating corridors and biological connectivity, that is also critical, and I would include possible prioritized corridors in that higher prioritization zone, and then whether there's 1 or 2 more levels below that, maybe there's a sort of secondary, intermediate, but still some native plants should be included, and then one you say, hey, this is incredibly altered land to begin with, it's a parking lot or whatever, it's not near much, here we're more interested in being water thrifty than that. I think that's something that I think with a little bit of effort in GIS analysis, we might be able to find some science that kind of backs that. I think there's some wildlife corridor and other similar studies that might start to suggest distances, or at least ranges of distances, that could at least narrow this into a place where there's something.
So sounds like that's a whole area of knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
That has to do with what kind of urban wildlife corridors, what could they be and what makes sense. It's not an arbitrary thing.
Right.
It's not just 500 to 1,000 feet. It's like, it could vary depending on.
And in fact, that literature exists on a very much focused on animals. And so there's really strong butterfly data. There's other arthropod data, there's bird data, and there is larger mammal data like coyotes. And in fact, if from a policy perspective, if it's better for the public to say, hey, we're encouraging stuff smaller than coyotes, we could focus on the numbers associated with birds and butterflies, as you pointed out, and attempt to use those. It's not perfect, but there's data there, and I think that if that's an approach that people would want to take, and I think it's an approach that would still be conducive to what Susan and others are saying, it still works with a rubric, and because I think that simplicity is really important. We can certainly go to extension or some others in the public academic community, wildlife biologists who really know that stuff, and get their input on those numbers, and it wouldn't be that hard. We're very close with the butterfly guy at UCSD.
Is the idea to create, sorry, I know I'm playing catch up.
No, I'm glad you're asking.
Is the idea to create corridors just for habitat, or is also the idea with having zones to then propagate native plants? So by naturally.
That's exactly right. So just as butterflies and birds need corridors to go, plants are similar, and whether it's their seeds or their pollen that need to disperse, they have maximum dispersal distances.
Exactly. And I think that's what I was thinking when you were talking scientific. I was thinking, how far will that seed travel? And, and what was that? This is so not mine. So.
And Tony will tell you that the plants are a little more complicated and different than the animals, because, for example, whether or not you're going to get some plant in a location has more to do with what's in the soil already in the long-lived seed bank. And especially for bird dispersed seeds, do the birds have a perch where they would go and poop in order to deliver that seed, more so than physical things like, does the seed drop from here and then roll or something like that. So I think that we could look at that literature too, but the animal stuff is likely to be a little simpler and you know, a little more straightforward. It might be a reasonable proxy in this case.
Yes, okay.
And so
Susan,
just to
yes.
add to what he's saying, that the idea is that if you blanket the whole city with some amount of natives, it's better because you're getting more plants over a greater area of dispersal.
Okay. And not raising the hand. Okay. Just being comfortable.
More resistance.
So what I've heard and what I've taken notes on is that it's good to have hierarchy of zones. Per some comments, Susan's primarily, that we do want to have some natives throughout the city. We don't necessarily want to do number 3, which is a no native. Well, we want to recommend there's natives across the city, but different hierarchies. And also what I'm hearing is that we really need to vet the idea of how do you make linkages and how much area then is needed to do connection, but also to do the edge treatments, kind of the edge buffering. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah.
So that's a little bit more of a drill down that's needed. It's okay to have things we don't know today, but it's as long as we know what we want to know. So one thing. So let's see if there's anything else. I'm sorry, I'm just looking. The idea is that, is this a good general approach? That was a question I had, and I think I got your feedback there, so thank you. And then as far as the maps, so my questions here are, is using our existing maps and data a good basis for identifying native zones? I didn't hear any concern with that. Good. Is using specific distances, and I think that's what we're going to vet. Should we consider this a first phase approach? Does this seem simple and practical as a first phase approach with looking at it from the perspective of an overlay? Do we think it's approachable, simple, practical enough? Maybe there's not consensus, but some.
I think without an overlay, any project that comes in front of us, they're either in it or not, and we'll be like, oh, but I'm 501 feet away from that. An overlay is the only way to really just put a pin in it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
I like that it's an informable process too, because some of this data is old, and currently we're working with the city parks staff to do red mapping of the park areas, for instance. So we can actually
Yeah, so-
provide new information that better informs
Okay.
the future process. So
Okay,
it's nice to have that kind of opportunity for information.
great.
I think nothing area should only be agricultural. I don't know if I can say that any clearer, but I think everything should have some level of native plant requirement codified, except agricultural, everything. So if it shows nothing here right now, that's not a good thing. from my point of view.
This map is not showing you that, Susan. This is just telling you what's actually physically present now. It's not a suggestion that any space should be abandoned to have no native plants.
And point to keep in mind is there are very few agricultural zoned properties in Encinitas. There are only 4. The old piece of the old Ecky Ranch, a piece of his sister's ranch, which there are few and far between. We went through this when we were going over the marijuana initiative, because everyone's like, oh, people are going to be growing marijuana everywhere because they can grow them in agricultural zones, and there's not. You know, Paul Ecky's ranch up behind your guys, behind Bill Gardens, you know, little tiny thing. He reached out to me and he says, is it worth trying to grow marijuana here? And we looked at it and said, no, not really. It's so it, you know, there was a large concern over the growing was going to create smells and neighborhood concerns, but honestly, a lot of people think there's a lot of agricultural property around here, but it's zoned something else.
Yeah, if I could add to that, we might as well incentivize natives in agricultural lands too. It will increase pollinators, and you know, if there's an agriculture area within the corridor, we don't have to write off the agriculture areas altogether.
Mm.
We should still try to encourage, incentivize,
Yeah,
because that's
most-
private property, so it wouldn't be.
And most of it is owned by, you know, kind of longtime Encinitas families, and they may, you know, it's like the Aki Ranch, you know, can't really competitively grow poinsettia flowers anymore. So a lot of the little pieces that are left, there's a good chance that the owners of those properties might welcome such a designation. You know, I think they're more like non-monetary incentives and, you know, proclamations in front of the city, awards, you know, things of that nature that, you know, most of those ranches, the old pieces are actually already pretty darn native. We just need to recognize it and encourage it.
I don't think that's correct. I mean, the
Is that
agricultural
right?
properties I'm aware of, tend very little to it.
Okay, well, that's,
I mean, first of all, they're mostly parking lot greenhouse, the big ones, and,
It's just what's volunteer.
yeah, I mean, there's very little native.
you know more about it than I am, just.
But I would just say, and I tend to keep my comments quiet from a policy perspective, but the fastest way to get the ire of the Farm Bureau and people that you'd rather not, you know, pay attention to this would be to tell farmers what to do. And since, as you point out, there's so little agricultural land left in Encinitas, what's the payoff?
Yeah.
Fighting that fight.
I think that falls under the program part where
Yeah.
we can make a program to encourage this. and-
There are already state and federal programs that incentivize farmers under certain conditions to plant confidential
I'm
cultivation.
thinking less about being incentivized for being a farmer than being incentivized for being a really great resident of Encinitas, coming from an old family, you know, let's, you know.
I guess really the agricultural doesn't need to be exempted, but I mean, because they could line the driveway with natives, but you know, it's just a more touchy thing.
Well, I'll go ahead and put a pin in it with that, and I've written down your comments. We don't have to solve it right now, but thanks for your comments. And I do want to move to the third item under this first task, which is preservation. And I think we've captured some of this already. Emphasis on preservation of native plants as a first approach, preserve what we already have. And then use outreach education. So this kind of comes under the program piece that Jennifer has organized for us to help incentivize people to steward native species on their lands. So it kind of plays in with that, only a broader arching
And
objective.
people love getting certificates in front
For
of council.
things like
with the
that,
newspaper taking
yes.
pictures.
Like the iNaturalist incentive, as someone brought up at the last meeting. So very good comments there on preservation. So I'm going to skip to task 2, and task 2 is using natives on public land, and then task 3 is using natives on private land. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a forward looking on what we're trying to do there. And then the last few tasks are more associated with the smaller aspects of what we're talking about. So when we're talking about public lands, we're talking about public works and parks. That's how I look at it. So I guess, you know, feedback there, if that's not what you are thinking. That's how I thought we were talking about it, government-owned landscapes. So keep in mind that it's not always city-owned. We have some county-owned and some other owned public lands. But the recommendations include, we look at policies and procedures regarding planning. We look at design. We look at construction phase and maintenance. And that's it. Okay. So, so thinking of it in terms of new projects that are coming forward, that maybe it's a streetscape. You know, I can think of things we've done recently, point those out. Maybe it's a park, maybe it's a trail, or, you know, whatever you might think.
Would an easy thing to do be to just classify a mature native tree as a heritage tree, since we already protect heritage trees?
A mature tree as far as preservation, is that what you're talking?
Mature.
Could we add it to the definition of a heritage tree, that if it's a native tree, it's automatically part of the heritage of the area because it's native?
I'm gonna defer to the.
I think most
UFAC.
mature natives are almost dead, because a lot of them don't live that long. There are some that do, and so you can't be generic as far as that. You need to be very specific about species. And I'm gonna, if I can switch to another note too. Before I really have any interest in like being a fan of this, I want to see the plant list. Because without a plant list to be determined later, is you're asking for a blank check to go put in policy. And that's, wait a minute, where's the plant list? Where there was what, how many trees promised on the east side of 101 during first streetscape? And there was a lot of hundreds. 88, it was great for marketing, but they all got yanked because of not having a long-term easement, which none of the streetscape really has that, but the trees got pulled out. So I want to know what the palette is, because there's something that people think are native, and then when you reach on people's private property, a lot of them have such compacted soil, they don't have, well, dirt, not soil. And will the natives grow there?
So I think there's a couple things that I've just heard. One has to do with heritage trees and preservation. And the other has to do with when you're thinking about design or what you're going to do in a project that the city owns, then you want to know what the plant list is.
And on the private property too. But what's, yeah, the plant list for this, that's the crux of this whole thing. If you don't have that, then you're not, nobody knows what they're really doing.
Does anybody think we need a separate list for trees? I mean, trees may be a unique enough category that.
There's a master list. It's not, native exclusive, but there is essentially a Manzanita specific taxonomic repository for trees for planning purposes. And I know that Chris has already worked on significant, lettered street plans and stuff like that. So there's already a lot of resources available for trees. That is true.
You make a good point too. So streets are different, I'm hearing. We already have plant palettes for trees on some streets. We've defined that. You did that, right? So those aren't native. I don't know that those are native.
This actually came up at our most recent meeting because there was a presentation provided to us about the next phase of the streetscape. And, despite what the overall count looks like or anything, there were a pretty high count of Torrey pines, live oaks, and then surprisingly even some large Engelmann oaks. And so I asked if that was based on some statute, mandate, ordinance, some requirement anywhere, and it didn't seem that that was the case. It was just sort of a grassroots.
Just that it happened.
So, yeah, so it doesn't seem that there's any operating native consideration within that broader city level tree planning list. So that may be another
Probably isn't.
matter.
I have not found it, and I've been looking. But I think with the streetscape, if I understand the history of it correctly, there was a lot of interest in natives when it was being designed and when it was being planned. But I don't think there was any kind of requirement.
I think some of that goes back to the old, original planted corridor of things like Torrey's down there. So I don't know whether that suggests that there's not a need or that there's already a trend toward something like that. But
I would say
for
anytime
whatever
there's
it's
a good trend that doesn't have policy to back it up, you probably
Just
put a
back off.
policy to back it up. No,
Okay.
no, I'm just like, don't leave it up to, because people change and philosophies change, and if you don't have a policy, you lose stuff.
Right.
That's my theory.
Can I jump in?
Katie first, please.
I had a really similar thought too, when we had a presentation by the city arborist to the Environmental Commission on our last meeting, talking about the update on the urban canopy cover goals. And a lot of that didn't really seem to have a strategy behind it. It was like, okay, let's plant 200 trees in a year. But there, from what we could tell, didn't really seem to be much of a consideration or recommendation for what proportion of those needed to be native. So if we could sort of codify some of those things and try to make sure that we're harmonizing the urban forest cover goals with this native policy that we're coming up with right now, that would be really good to do from the get-go. And so it's cool to hear that Streetscape had a lot of natives. What I thought I heard, but there weren't a lot of resources for us to view at this time, was that there weren't a lot of natives being planted in this effort to plant 100 trees in the past year. We also might need to reconsider what is our definition of a tree. I think in terms of this meeting these canopy goals, a tree was anything that was higher than 10 feet, is that right? So a lot of native shrubs and bushes could be greater than 10 feet, so can we call those trees or not? I'm just kind of thinking through some of that stuff.
That's a good point too. Yeah.
Well, but there is, there are problems with trying to require natives. So in the streetscape plan, the one of the highest number of trees was a western redbud, which is a small native. And so it fits that niche of smaller tree, native tree. It's not a very hardy tree. And I don't know what the
And
percentage
it's not going to do much for storing.
of success with that tree
It's also
is.
one of the least valuable in terms of insect resource, which in turn makes it the least valuable for bird.
Yeah.
But Ari, answer this question. Would it be on the list that we're talking about, do you think?
Yeah.
On the general list, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is the thing, right? So like, there's some really great like rules of thumb that a lot of cities have adopted for, in particular for street trees, like these 50, 30-20 rules, right? Like, no more than 20%, of trees in a given area should be the same species, no more than 30% same genus, 50% same family. And we may have rules like that already in place. But like adding a native component to that, also 50% native, I mean, you sort of force a level of diversity, taxonomically, but you let people make decisions within that framework. And that kind of thing has worked very well for other cities. We unfortunately have a smallish native tree palette, especially if you look at trees, and really native to the coastal part of San Diego County. Unless we want to start considering like Shaw's agave and trees. At least like flowers. But that's a different question.
I think Kevin,
I know that up in LA, they do a 4-inch trunk diameter, 4 feet tall. And it makes it kind of easy because you can remember one number, 4-inch diameter, 4 feet tall, we save it, we protect it. And also, if the cumulative shrub branches add up to 4 inches of diameter, because shrubs are a lot shorter sometimes, then they include that shrub might be protected. But they don't protect every native. They protect anything that's an endangered native. But our county does have a list, and our and some of these other resources we listed, they list endangered species. So we could refer to their list, or we could create our own smaller list. The list in LA is pretty small. It's only about 6 trees and a couple of shrubs. But we could broaden it to be all of this if we want, or some subset of it, but whatever we choose, codify it. Because let me tell you this, if I told you, I want everybody to own a chicken, would you go out and buy a chicken? I don't think so. But if you say every citizen must have a chicken if you own a home, yep, you'd have a chicken because it's code, and you'd go buy that chicken. What would happen to it later? I don't know, unless we have more code that says we're going to inspect you and see if you still have that chicken next year. You know what I'm saying? So if it isn't codified, it isn't real. It doesn't happen.
Yeah,
So it has to be
but your
codified.
point is preservation. I appreciate that. Kevin, did you have something?
Yeah, and everything all my notes from this point on are policy oriented. So speaking to Jennifer here, I know now we do need a policy to protect our mature trees, and that should be codified. And I'm looking at them in terms of like how much carbon they're holding. We cut down a big tree and, grind it up into sawdust, we're releasing that. It's like, and one little tree doesn't replace it. So I would like to see all mature trees protected in this manner. And we're attached to, so this is public lands. When we take out a tree, large or native or non-native, we should have a replacement policy in place. And it should be not a 1-to-1 replacement. It should be a much greater percentage.
Okay.
And since we are talking public and private land, it's not like, oh, you got to trim 6 little native trees where that one big tree is. You can spread them out. But as a policy written in, we should be knowing how much is that tree worth in terms of additional small trees. We're a tree city, USA. you know, we can handle this slightly differently when it comes to private lands, but in public lands, we should have this down. I know the Urban Forest Advisory Committee, when we took out the 3 big eucalyptuses, 2 in front of the post office and 1 in front of corner frame shop, I think they did a 3 for 1 or 6 for 1. They were,
It was 5.
was it
I
5?
think so.
Thank you. Yeah, but it was a multiple, and I think we could probably come up with a formula, something that in planning, they could just plug in the numbers and know what you gotta
Generally, it's
do.
3 to 1.
Yeah. You know, and it could be that certain trees are more valuable and therefore require a higher multiple. And I'm not qualified to make that specific judgment, but I'm certainly
Yeah.
qualified to enforce it if it's written down.
So I hear a big emphasis on trees. And I think when we talk about our public spaces, that's where we go in our heads, you know, because the trees have a lot of value, preserving them, but also planting and replacing. So that's good. I got those notes. What do you think about if just say there's a roadway, I don't know why I think roadway, but usually, you know, that's like, it's hard to put landscape there. So say there's a roadway in an area on our map where it's in a native plant area. Should that be approached from the perspective of the same perspective as every other development in that area, that the emphasis would be on all natives if it's infrastructure improvement like a roadway?
Part of the landscape along the roadway is both traffic calming and the right size and shapes of things as far as for running the city. And then you've got, but most of this soil has been just beat to hell. There isn't really soil. I mean, it's where you're planting things on. Will a plant perform to what you need that plant to perform for? Because it's doing so much more than just growing for itself. It's what is it contributing to the community?
So I think we could, I agree with you on that, because so I think if I follow that thought, there may be some places where 100% natives would work and they would perform well. But other places, I can imagine like a 10-foot wide median, that might not be ideal for a native plant to thrive over time. It may not be a good investment of our public funds to plant those because they just would not thrive over time. Now I'm going to throw that out there as just maybe a question. What do you guys think?
I think that it's a similar vein to what Ari mentioned about farmers, that's a heavy-handed imposition on a lot of work that has gone into existing tree planting throughout the city. So I think that would not be looked upon fondly by all of the people involved with that day-to-day implementation and people who've dedicated their careers to this point, to making our city's tree planting what it is, which is actually pretty robust. So trees may be worth considering separately just for the purposes of actually being less draconian in the kind of native salute approach. That's just.
Okay. Katie, did you have a comment?
I was just thinking about if it's a place like a median where the soil's not ideal for natives, we have the complementary palette. So if you can plant a native, they're great. If you can't, you've got the complementary palette. Can those sort of standards apply across these different zones to make it more simple
I see.
and not be
Okay.
so mandating you must, if practicable, do, if not, then go back to the second list.
That's good thought. Yeah.
I just want to second what Ari said about the percentages of natives versus what other groups that you want to have, as opposed to you must plant a native. You must choose one of those natives.
Okay.
You know, to have in this area, you have to have a certain percentage of natives versus.
Good feedback. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree, but there's a policy already in place or, some standards in place that have worked for other cities, like, let's not reinvent the wheel. Think about that in our policies too, maybe include that in that policy.
Yeah, I mean, there's 50, 30, 20 rules or 40, 40, 40, there's a lot of them, But they're great. I think it's a little harder for us, just because the palette is different here. It's a lot easier to do that in the Northeast and even at native or the Midwest. But I think they can be done, and I think as long as they're flexible, I think if we get into one of the things I worry about is especially with heavy mandates, you must be 100% native here, even 80% native. What we might get is really ugly landscapes in those locations where there are, that are just struggling to survive, and they're alive enough that that the landowner or manager is meeting their obligation under the law or under the regulation, but everybody driving by or walking by is like, man, that is ugly. And we already sort of have to fight this unfortunate reality that not everybody looks at the coastal sage scrub, and especially in the summer, and sees beauty, which is an unfortunate aesthetic decision that people make or a condition. And I think one of the things that we should be thinking in our minds, which is a very non-scientific thing, that I'm usually always, it's unscientific, I think, but one of the very non-scientific things we should consider is that one of the net effects of these policies and laws should be to help people develop a robust sense of appreciation for the native landscape and want to, say with pride, you look at this over here, you from some other part of the world might not think this is beautiful. Just in the way probably years ago, people didn't think saguaro cactuses were beautiful, but now you go into Arizona and you see a saguaro forest, you're like amazing. We have that same problem we have to overcome, and struggling plants is I think there's something in evolutionarily inside of us that when we see a struggling organism, including a struggling plant, it's hard for us to feel positive about it.
All right, good input. I really appreciate it.
There's just one more thing about the policy for tree preservation.
Mhm.
I do believe there is one already. No?
We've talked about it, and we are going in that direction for mature tree preservation, but it's not in place yet. And that's all true.
Yeah, because it's the safety aspect of.
I know.
It is really is probably foremost thought in the city arborist of taking down mature trees.
Yeah.
So.
Well, having a logical process for how we evaluate that as far as whether it's a risk. And I was just listening to the UPEC meeting, which you were talking about that. You guys were talking about that the last UPEC meeting. But yeah, having a process, and I think we have one in place where we add the trees and we measure to define risk assessment.
One really just a quick technical point. So in terms of public lands, so just for harmonization with other city policies, the IPM policy, which is an ordinance, the part of it that holds city lands accountable to a higher standard is only for city owned and managed lands, right? So the city lessees are not held to that standard, but they're held to the other normal standards of the city. And I would recommend that approach here as well.
Oh yeah, I do have it actually, but so the way I put it here is on the next page, the integrated pest management strategy for natives. Is that how you see capturing that?
No. I'm just saying that the native policy is like this, where it deals with city managed lands, but it does not hold city owned but leased lands to the same high standard as the city owned and managed lands. And I would say that whatever the higher standard is that we create for city owned and managed lands should not apply to city leased, city lessees.
All right, what would be an example of include easements?
Oh, it's like the Botanic Garden and the Heritage Ranch and, all these little pieces of land that have been parts of Santa Leo Lagoon Conservancy that are now Nature Collective, that are on the, on the deeds and titles part of the city, but the city through some kind of a lease agreement has basically handed management off to somebody else.
Thank you for mentioning that and clarifying it. So I do have a few questions in this, but I think we've already hit most of them. Should we emphasize trees as in the native plant ordinance since there are a few native trees? And I think maybe the answer is yes, we should, because there are enough native plant trees. So that's what I'm hearing. Should we incentivize specimen size when availability is likely to be an issue? I think someone had suggested that we should have larger specimens with native plants. But then I see also there was a concern that availability of plants is an issue. So that's just worth.
Well, also survivability. I mean, there's a lot, the research is much better outside of the Southwest, but there's a lot of wonderful evidence, especially in oaks and maples, that planting a smaller plant and letting it grow and develop its root system in situ rather than planting a larger plant, which requires root trimming to get the bulb to grow after into it. Actually, after 5 years, you have a healthier, larger tree with having planted a smaller plant first.
Yeah.
So it's again, that research hasn't been as well replicated in our climate as in other parts of the country, as far as I know. But it's sometimes the big splash right up front doesn't get you that 5 years later.
Great, good input. I'm gonna push forward just a little bit here.
I do like where you say to use this existing San Diego Sustainable Landscape Guideline book of,
Okay,
that I think anytime you can use an existing resource like that and not reinvent the wheel, as long as it's a good resource, we're miles ahead.
that's a good point. Thank you for that.
This policy should have been in place maybe a decade ago. So we're very behind on this. And so the sooner we can get something down, the better. I mean, it could be updated later, but I really think using resources that exist is the way to go to make it move a little faster.
And if there are other resources out there that are good resources, please bring that information forward. We'll make sure that we think about that when we finalize these recommendations. Thank you. So since native plant communities are different than parks, trails, and public works facilities, what would the city need that is different that we don't have to be able to plan for, design, review, oversee, construction, maintain, and steward native plant communities? That's a long way of saying, does the city need to consider additional resources also at the same time as far as how we look at our public lands and how we manage them? So that was my way of throwing out the question about management and stewardship for public lands that are native. What do you think?
I think it's a great question. My feeling is that the city has the expertise on staff to do this properly, but not the resources that would be needed to create the contracts to do natural lands management as opposed to other forms of land management. We have a really good habitat stewardship plan. If you look at the budgets in that, they're very old. They really are only assuming one-time treatments to kind of get the quality up and then incredibly minimal maintenance costs after that, if any at all. And I think just really unrealistic. And so probably a really good review of that document and updating of the establishment and maintenance costs within it could also include more natural areas under city purview, but it's a really good start. It's a great framework document, and updating it should tell us that.
And you have hands-on experience with that, so
We
you have that experience. So I appreciate that comment.
I think we can also look into the Beacons Bluff restoration plan that just went through. Was supposedly going to repopulate the bluff with native landscape, and it's got maintenance and stewardship built into that. I think that might be a good model to look into, since let's look at existing plans where we actually have already tried to do this.
Okay.
I've had the pleasure of being able to work with the city's parks team on this specifically, and I've been quite heartened as somebody who's coming in to try to provide something that presumably the city is lacking. And I find that there's a lot of aptitude, interest, and growing. So, city park staff definitely do what they can, and the resource availability rather than the personal, investment or any kind of professional limitation seems to be the major kind of bottleneck in what I'm seeing. So there seems to be an eagerness to step up into something that's just not quite fleshed out and thus resourced quite yet on the behalf of the city staff. So
Good.
sort of a second to what Ari was saying.
Okay, thank you. Of course, we can come back, but let's jump forward for now to task 3, using natives on private development. Now, in many ways, the new projects, so this would be new residential, commercial, industrial, and office development in application process through city planning and development services. Now, that's how we've characterized it all along. And this would include privately owned environmental and open space easements, which we really hadn't talked about before now.
That's
So,
interesting.
yeah, but just throwing it out there, recommendations, create incentives for land use which are excluded from this policy to conform with this policy, like new single-family residential homes, even though it's not included, it would be, there might be an incentive for new single-family homes to use natives, existing single-family homes and homeowners associations. I'm trying to capture what we've said, and I'm not sure if I got it right.
Why would single family homes not be included?
We've talked about this in.
Didn't we all agree last meeting that we would want them to be included? I thought.
I didn't capture that quite that way, so let's talk about that right now. So a new single-family home does go through the city for permitting. Maybe you
But
guys can
no
help.
design review.
No design review. So it's a different process.
Specifically exempt, unfortunately. And, that gives people the ability to build their dream house or something not so pretty for the rest of us, but that's codified in our general plan. We don't do that.
So, but there really wouldn't be already a process in place to review for.
Good. We could
Plants.
plug in something concerning landscaping. I'm Jennifer, you're
Anna's
planning-
right there. She's chomping at the bit to
Yeah.
speak.
Single family homes in the coastal zone require a coastal development permit. Otherwise, if you're not in the coastal zone, then it's a straight building permit for nuisance count. But
Thank you,
it's
Anna.
correct, there's no design review required.
Okay. Okay.
Landscape plans are triggered with design review.
They are, at building permit though, if they are proposing landscaping, they're not required to, if they're proposing landscaping, that they have to abide by our water efficient landscape requirements.
So this is good to get your feedback on right now. It's something that I'm not entirely clear on. Any other comments on this before we move on, whether single family is included?
Well, are we talking about including them just as offering incentives? Nothing is mandated.
That's how I put it forward, as incentives.
And so would this design review be in place to incentivize single family homes? Will the incentives remain the same for this type of development and other types of private development? Would
Yeah.
it be similar?
That's a good point. Okay.
I can remember floating out an incentive idea where you've got a building a new single family home. We can source you and donate to you native plants that would thrive in your development. Maybe not all of them, but it's enough to push people over the edge and say, oh yeah, sure, that's great. And I'll get these two guys to help me,
Also, take new single family residential homes is an opportunity as opposed to existing homes. I think it's really hard to, I think it is much easier to incentivize for
Okay.
natives in new building.
Okay, I've written some comments down. This is something we'll put a pin into and just get your comments and then move to the next.
Can I jump in just
Maybe
real
we
quick
can,
before we move on?
Yep.
Sorry. I was looking at the maintenance stewardship section of this. I mean, these are not the people who are not less concerned about the people excluded from this, but I'm thinking of a lot of commercial developments, specifically lately. I've been noticing a lot of parking lots that have their mandatory shade trees, and they're Those some of the saddest looking trees. And a lot of times they get replaced, not with shade trees, but with dinky little palm trees that provide no shade.
Yeah.
And I mean, if we're thinking about our climate action plan, we should really be focusing on shading those parking lots with actual trees. And we actually have, I mean, Bruce Ayers could probably source us with a whole bunch of coastal live oaks that provide lovely shade. That one is, I think we want the monitoring and stewardship. I think we also need to trigger some sort of enforcement on this, because there's a lot of parking lots, a lot of commercial developments that have, they were obligated to plant certain kinds of trees, and they've now changed those trees.
There was no obligation to maintain. That was to get a building permit and to get the project happening. And we've talked about this in the UFAC. There was no obligation by any means, and the city has no right to enforce, from what we were told, to say you've got to have a tree in there, even any tree.
So
Well, that's maybe how it has been, but maybe we look at how it.
Right, I'm just,
Let's-
that is.
that's
Yeah.
a really good thing to know, because we should have enforcement, and this is a perfect opportunity to plug some of that in.
I've made a note.
Just one other quick comment on that is that a big part of why some of these trees may be failing to live is that the soil conditions are really rough.
Mhm.
And there's been wonderful research out of Australia and other places with similar climate on what are called constructed soils, which are very purposefully designed. And there are good specs on this, for good street trees to survive under heavily impacted conditions in the middle of parking lots with heavy things coming over them. And so we may need to include the soil specs in a pretty specific way in order to allow for the survival of real broad.
Might be a good time also to look at the size of tree wells and what kind of,
That's in those specs.
it's in the specs, okay, but works for
Because
me.
oxygen is as important as water.
It's mostly a compaction issue. And so it's really about the volume of the space and the kinds of and sizes of substrate, matrix. It's not exactly soil, it's kind of that will resist compaction, because of there's really interesting research on this. And Australia is a leader, and they're a compatible climate, and it's really
Good. Great. I've made notes of that. That would come under design and construction so that the soils and everything are appropriate before it even gets. Okay. Yes.
After the season of planting natives is the rainy season, and when I lived in Venice, I put in golden currants along a really long fence, about 100-foot long fence. And I had helped a friend of mine start a business. It was called Get Planted Native. And he did all this work with native plants, and a friend of mine joined him, and they were doing this little business of planting plants. So when I went to Las Felitas and I wanted to order these plants, they only sell them at the appropriate time to plant them, pretty much, because they know that they're not going to survive if you buy them at the wrong time of year. But my friend, who knew all this stuff he had been working for pulling out invasives, and he'd worked up in Humboldt County and all over the place in the state, pulling invasives to preserve natives. And what he said is, plant it when the first rain comes. He's like, you have to wait. So we did all the preparation ahead, and we did put in a little bit of drip irrigation ahead. And then we waited, and we planted in the rainy season. They did beautiful golden currant. They're beautiful. They were little tiny things when I bought them. And then they grew up to the height of the fence within a couple of years. They're just beautiful.
Awesome.
So the time of year you plant is very important.
Nice story there too. Okay, thank you. Let's jump on to task 4, because I'd like to wrap up these last few tasks. I think they're simpler, so I think we can do that in the next 10 minutes or so, maybe 15. And then we'll have public comment, and then if there is any, and then we'll wrap up the meeting. So we're going to jump to rainwater harvesting. The input that I captured was, this is about, it's sometimes the same thing as stormwater capture, recreating and restoring natural ecosystems to benefit plants. So coordinate with other ordinances, because we already have stormwater and erosion control MS4 requirements. and develop a native plant standard for stormwater facilities such as retention basins, and then also guidance for native plants appropriate for rainwater harvesting. And the summary also included consider incentives that could create demonstration gardens, coordinated with schools, education, incentivize biodiversity gardens tied to education and communication. Those are the thoughts that we put out there that I've captured. Is there anything else to add to rainwater harvesting or anything that you have comments on at this time? It's a great opportunity to really create more of a permaculture, more of a natural, sustainable native system with the right plant materials.
I support it. I think you
Got
hit
it?
the nail on the head.
Okay. Now, task number 5, objective permitting. Objective permitting. That doesn't quite sound right. Sorry. Permitting fees, existing codes need updating, and the city's role in native plant policy. A recommendation was the existing landscape code should be modified to include native plant policy for private development. Incentives should be considered. City review the plans and design. It must include knowledgeable professionals and standards for species composition. Now, we haven't really talked about that yet. And spacing appropriate to meet the goals for the work. So we didn't really talk about species composition yet. Is there anything we need to note about that?
So are you saying that for private development, you have to have professional plan review? You have to hire professionals for your plan, for the plans that you're submitting to the city?
No, I think the intent was that it would be reviewed by the city, because item 3 says city review of plans and design. So that's the review. I think perhaps this item got a little bit too wordy and was not necessarily clear. So sorry about that. But the sentiment, I think, is that the plans would be reviewed by someone who understands native plants. Okay, if I could maybe modify it that way.
What about the city standards to increase biodiversity, like the 50-40, whatever it was, would that be helpful for guiding species composition goals? Or is that
I don't know.
a separate thing? I don't know, to increase diversity within the landscape? Maybe some existing guidance.
So I think the point might be you're making guidance would be helpful. Maybe not sure what that is today, right now,
Yeah.
but some guidance for the composition. And I think some of that comes from when I'm a landscape architect, so I see designs and I see what people are doing, and sometimes the composition isn't maybe what's intended for the resilience and sustainability. It could be better. So, Tony, did you have something?
I was curious or just wondering if that third B point might be kind of a relic related to some of the early conversations that we had been describing, the possibility of having almost different like plant palette zones, which was something that also came up in the county level of this, conversation. So I wasn't sure if that was where that species composition might have come from in part, but if so, that's probably not simple or pragmatic, but the basics though, like you mentioned.
Yes, I hear that.
Of, is this a suitable tree for this space, for instance, with spacing and that kind of stuff? That being part of the review seems to make total sense. So as long as it's one and not the other.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, I
More
don't know
thoughts?
just one last related note. Are we intending that you can pick any species from the native palette and they can all go together and all be fine? Or, some from the native, some from the complementary or secondary palette, no,
So this is that balance, I think.
Hunky-dory.
This is that balance, where it's simple and open to the owner to interpret,
Okay.
or more complex with more rigid standards that is less flexible. So
Are there any native species that just don't do well together?
Uh,
There'll be
I
like succession happening and like dominate. It's like-
I mean, it's like regular gardening, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you get your hydrozoning wrong. I mean, there's limited illegal happening. There's more direct competition because you can shake something else out. But I mean, it's.
Better than nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think like there's a philosophical question of like whether the city is really gonna try to tell everybody what to do, or whether they're nudging people into the direction of experimenting with this plant palette in a way that is a positive gardening experience for people in the way that they currently experience gardening, which is to go to garden centers, decide what they want and try it out at home. I think there's a lot of statistics out there that say, the highest level, professional horticulturists planting woody plants, are lucky if they only have a 20% death rate, after planting. And we've seen from Chris and others that the street trees have a much higher death rate than cities because it's a really challenging
hard
environment.
place.
It's a hard place.
our place to
Yeah.
live.
So I mean, I think we have to assume that people, they need to have the freedom to experiment and, to understand their places, recognize we live in a challenging horticultural climate. Imports natives may help them, because some of the natives are easier to cultivate, but some of them are harder. I mean, Tony works with the native plants that are the hardest. He's dying for Strelitzia.
Yeah. So it's a bit of the carrot and the stick too, I think,
Yeah.
in that being simple and practical, I think we lean towards the side of being less regulatory. And it's more of the carrot. So when we get down to education, we talk about demonstration gardens and model gardens that set the example that people can learn from. So maybe that's a way to go instead of mandating a certain standard. That's a really good question though. So we'll jump to commercial availability. I know this is tricky, so if I didn't capture this right, let me know, but I've got 3 points there. Production from retail and wholesale native nurseries in San Diego is limited, I've been told. And I have that actual experience as well. And it's a very unpredictable thing in my experience. But so the suggestion was an idea like bringing the nature collective into this process regarding production of natives. So I captured that and consult with representatives from local nurseries to really understand this better. Is there anything else we should talk about regarding availability that we should capture and make sure we somehow either work into a program that we coordinate and maybe consider the nursery association as a partner and figure out how to work this better, or what?
I
Yes.
don't know, but does the city already discourage planting palm trees, which are non-native, Does the city discourage that actively? Because they really should.
Some of the palm trees are invasive, so that would be true for those.
I don't believe there's any new in city land that we're not planting any more palms. Is it not accurate on our list?
In city land.
In city right of way and whatnot.
Yeah.
But also, most of the palms have been taken off the city-approved street
Yes.
tree list as well.
So that's city. I don't know if you think about private, but I do see them going in a private. Am I,
But private is separate.
is separate, it's different? Yeah.
Yes. We have a lot of vacant tree planting sites that city has easement on, but being able to use those is.
I have one comment that I've heard in other meetings when they're talking about hurdles for commercial availability. In that that these nurseries have to have some sort of commitment of that these native plants are going to be purchased. So, if for example, if you can do some sort of commitment on streetscape of, you want so many natives.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, it's a several seasons effort to grow a plant. And so they need to know well in advance that that effort's going to be fruitful for them.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get plants grown on contract.
Yeah.
Almost anything you want to. And I think that really, in another conversation we've had, we've talked about, maybe the city will buy them and give them out to some people, like that might be one of the incentives. So that, the city is in a good place to enter into those kind of contracts. The folks up in Santa Barbara have been doing that a little bit, not with trees, with smaller native plants. And then what they've found is that the local nurseries will, if they give an order for whatever, 500 plants, they'll, and the local nursery knows they're going to sell those 500 plants. They'll grow 600 or 700 of them. They'll take the risk on the margin, knowing that they've got 500 sold. So there's a double benefit, to that. They may end up also available, some of them, because it's you're smoothing the risk of some of these local nurseries.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna,
I
yes,
have
Tom.
one thing to just add as a note to everybody on this subject, that local plants don't have to come from local nurseries, and I think that's a risk of getting over myopic on this one, because like what Ari mentioned, contract growing, for instance, there are a couple of big good nurseries that would serve that role, and they're not in Encinitas,
Oh,
but
yeah.
there could be
Right.
a strategy to actually get those types of places to grow materials suitable to here specifically. So we love growing plants in Encinitas, and it's such a historical nursery space that I often have this conversation easily slip into, that we should encourage these being grown somewhere right here, and it doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to jump to education and outreach. I was really relying heavily on Commissioner Switzler's spreadsheet because, and I don't know if we have a copy of that, but we all received it at the last meeting, because he had summarized pretty well some educational opportunities and outreach, and it was a 2-year plan. And I think in here, the very last thing is the model and demonstration landscapes that I mentioned earlier, also developing an ambassador or eco-diversity garden program. And we should ask the public as we go through public comment as this evolves, if they have some ideas about that. Yes, Karen.
Yeah, I have another idea, and that would be to incentivize BUSD to do some native demonstration garden.
That would be so cool.
Because that you're at the same time you're educating all these little kids, and of course PTAs have to be involved. There's a lot of parents have to be involved, and there's a lot of room for improvement in the EUSD landscapes.
Right.
So,
I think that's a great idea.
but they're and also from when I my kids are grown now, but there wasn't so much in the way of expertise.
Yeah.
So I think they could really use expertise, because the city has a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Awesome. Good. I'm going to jump to the last one, removing natives and or culturally significant trees, reuse and repurpose. We talked about that. We're demonstrating that already on Lucadia Streetscape. I don't know if anyone might have any other comments on this based on what I've written here.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yes,
Because
yes,
I do
Kevin.
have some, so now we need to look into a trigger for this, because now those 3 trees and a couple of years ago, the other couple of big trees, which are turning into benches, about to go into the ground now, happened because local neighborhood organizations raised a fuss and something happened about it.
Okay.
There's a lot of other trees that maybe don't have local advocates, and it's a wasted opportunity for the city. So we should have a street, especially city trees greater than a certain size, I leave that to the experts, should be slated for repurposing. They need to be big enough diameter and long enough to be cut into those cool slabs of lumber. We also need to codify that point, because the one that just went down in front of the post office, beautiful blue gum tree. It was what looked the healthiest of the bunch. It was super hollow for 6 or 8 feet up. But Russ Levan was there. We preserved like a 10 or 12 foot beautiful straight hunk, and then they set it down next to the their truck where, kind of rust wasn't allowed back there. And we went to all this effort to preserve this 12-foot hunk, which they then sliced up, not into half, but into 3 separate hunks, 4 feet long.
No.
And they're wasted.
Wow.
They're wasted.
Oh, my gosh.
And,
Okay.
nobody was on hand to say, wait a minute there, or it should be like really clearly specified when we salvage big hunks of wood, because we waited to get a special crane because the piece of wood was so big.
That's not a first.
It's not a first?
No, there's been many times when that
Yeah.
wood's been meant to be saved. And if a Slayer is, I have a tree service and I have a.
I know.
But so if a Slayer is not involved in the process before the tree hits the ground, you don't have, or at least the end user, somewhere between the two,
Mhm.
so that you can produce something that's actually wanted and it gets cut into the wrong dimensions, or there's that perfect curve that's just you'll never see again in
Yeah.
your life in a tree that you could mill that and make something really spectacular. The Slayer is gonna see that, or the craftsman. But the contractor, it was really hard for me to train the guys that work for me to start cutting things for lumber instead of efficiently getting it on the ground to process, to make it go away so we can move to the next thing.
And I'm not sure how to fix that issue, but we need to fix that.
We are working.
You're on it. I love you guys. You're
We're
like,
working on it.
I really do.
I mean, there's other craftsmen involved, but I can salvage wood too, as far as I would from
I
city
know.
wood and get it back, but it's like, I need to, gotta be part of the process when it comes down.
Yep. Thank you.
So for whatever it's worth, we're actually working on this in the UFAC at a whole city tree level. So not private trees, which this may be relevant for addition. But, Brian is kind of spearheading this because he has so much firsthand experience with what it takes to actually do this stuff. But we're actually working toward putting forward, a tree sort of salvage and reuse,
Urban wood policy.
sure.
Awesome. I'm glad to.
That is awesome.
that
Thank
update.
you really so much, both of you, for your work here.
Well, it's so nice to connect the dots like that, and this group is a good group to do that.
I think it goes back to task number 7 of education and outreach.
Mhm.
There just needs to be a lot of education and outreach.
I'm
And
sure.
more than you think it needs.
More than you think.
Every single way,
Okay.
over and over again, and you still won't have saturated.
I mean, on a related note, we're talking about the salvaging the wood. Now I know that the pruning schedule is now it's like every 3 years you go out and you trim this one. A lot of times I'm spotting this where like the crews going out there are just tree trimmers. And they get a little thing that says, trim this tree, and they look up at it, it's got hardly any branches on it, so they go and cut half of them off because they were told to trim the tree. Nobody's there saying, that doesn't really need trimming, or maybe just this branch or that branch, and let the rest of it puff out a little bit.
Well, I'm gonna suggest we're getting a little off topic.
We are a little off topic,
Bring us
but
back. I'm reeling us.
I'm at,
Although.
Joy, I'm at the
good-
end of my list.
Good
now.
things to talk about. What I'd like to do is just kind of wrap this up and open it up for public comment. Jennifer, do you know if we have anyone who wants?
I have like a
1,000 questions for you.
There's a process we have. Would you
I
like
have
to?
there's pink slips. If you'll please put your name and then I'll grab it from you.
Got it.
And if you'd like to help us manage the public comment process.
I have one question. Some of the areas where you've got a lot of hotspots with native plants, there's also happens to be a lot of large eucalyptus rows that intersect into those. And so with this policy, be wanting to eradicate those, so it was all native? Because I've seen that happen before, or but also part of the heritage of my Encinitas.
You
What
make a
would
good
happen
point.
there? Because I don't want to see invasion to go kill a bunch of trees in the name of keeping things alive. And that happens.
I can speak to the current
Okay.
practice and the, PHSP that we're working through right now, which is that nothing bigger than a 6-inch DBH goes, regardless of whether or not it's listed invasive. So for the existing work that we're doing on public property, new seedlings, that kind of stuff all gets cut down, but mature trees are anathema to do anything to harm. So maybe that could persist through something like this even, you know, mature trees versus native habitat.
And is that a practice, or did you think it was maybe
That-
written somewhere?
That was actually a stipulation in the RFP. And it's something that is standard practice across all of the sort of parkland administration and management from what I've seen.
Okay. It'd be good to know more about that.
Yeah, it was something that came from the mayor originally, from what I gather. So I don't know that it's like written in an ordinance or policy explicitly. So
Okay,
it may be something that is on that same level of getting native trees into streetscape.
okay. Good, thank you.
So there's two public comments. And typically it's 3 minutes each. If that's what you want to continue, given the time.
Sure, yeah, that would be our standard.
Okay.
That's what we've done all along.
All right, so I'm going to call Tim Clancy first.
Okay, is there a justification for the introduction of this policy that will compel private property owners to choose plant material from a list that nobody in this room thinks is important enough to create specifically for this city? That's the first question. On the issue of incentives and incentivizing people, is it fair to me to incentivize my neighbor and give him real services or products that cost money to the city, and I get nothing because I just happened to do my project 5 years ago? So incentives don't seem fair to me, to those of us that can't participate. Put forth that if natives are so great and important, and I like natives, why does this city not have very many native plant gardens? Because the people that live here don't want to plant stuff that doesn't look good certain times of the year, and they know that. So your constituents have spoken by what they buy and sell. You go to Home Depot, the former Sunshine Gardens, they have a small section of natives and a whole bunch of other stuff that you would think are not natives. That is a function of the marketplace showing you what they want. Again, on that same question, if natives are so great, then why do we need to codify it? I mean, I've been working in the landscape industry in San Diego since 1987. I have thousands of plants, natives, non-natives. I have been to seminars about natives. My point is here is that there's plenty of information and education about natives there. It's not a new concept that we need to shove down private property owners' throats to get them to do something that for some reason, which again, I haven't seen the justification. And if there is a justification, I may change my mind. But until I have a justification, then I can't support this on private property. What you all decide to do on public property, I don't really have anything to say against it. I like it. I live 3 blocks from the San Luis Lagoon. I'm down there all the time. This 2-for-1 planting, how long is that sustainable? And the reason I ask that question is because we have a finite number of vacant tree planting sites available to us. And if every time we take out 1, we plant 2, at some point we're going to run out. So is anybody looking forward to that? Knowing when that's going to be? Because that's important to determine what percentage of what species we're planting where, if we're going to use the 5, 10, 15, or 10, 20, 30.
Tim, I think that was the 3-minute sound. So you do have a lot of comments. So I appreciate your comments in oral here today. I don't know if we've got the answers for you right now. If you want to provide some more comments in writing, we'll accept that. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Can we just, is there a justification, or are we just like, oh, we have a great idea, we're going to thrust it on people that's needed.
The justification for this in general, I think, is what you're asking. And
No, I'm specific. I want to know
I mean-
specifically, why would you compel me, a private property owner who wants to build my dream commercial building, to plant plants that I don't like?
we're getting feedback that from the public that they are interested in this. They're interested in native plants. So we're trying to create policies. So that's really
So
the
if-
basis.
Okay, but just drive down the street and show me where you're getting, you're telling me you're getting feedback that people are interested. I walk around Village Park, and I don't see a lot of people interested in native plants.
Well, you make very good points. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next speaker. Who is that?
Bruce Ayers.
Okay.
So my comments about street trees, and I thought, I think we need to be careful. There may be native trees that can go anywhere, and specimen trees that are cut up as specimens. I love native oaks, as you know. If you look at Rancho Santa Fe Road, where it goes up and over the hill in Carlsbad, there are native oaks in the center. Some of them are thriving, but they've got 10, 12 feet by 12 feet. And they must have good soil conditioning, so the spec, I totally appreciate that. They are not cut, they're not trimmed as specimen trees. And they're gonna be limited, right? Because as they grow to 30, 40 years old, those limbs would wanna come down and go right across the middle of travel lanes. So I love them there, as long as they can be there, great, but they're gonna end up being trimmed up into taller specimens of a native oak. So I think we have, and I'll use the example, I walk through Liebenhain and New Encinitas a lot. And I've seen the results of the city street tree planting. My neighbor, suddenly on his property, they decided it was a vacant lot and they planted 2 trees, and they're cassia, they're not native. Or they are, what's the other one?
Acacia.
It could be acacia, but I think one was, I've seen on Summer Holly where they did the entire street with the new sidewalks and whatnot. They put in probably jacaranda and all totally non-native, but they are also in 4-foot wide strips. And we have to have some native specimens that would work in those locations and in those best management practices, filtration holes. And I think it can be done, but I think you're going to have general native and then a sub for the more difficult native plantings where you're really going to get into the structure underneath. So that's that comment. It's a question as much as maybe a comment. Symbiotic relationship between plants. The one thing I didn't hear tonight when we were talking about plant groupings is the natural symbiotic relationship between certain natives. Certain natives, when planted together, will do better together than they will apart. You know, oaks with gooseberry, they're all sorts of wonderful, and I've noticed it in my 30 years of experimentation, but I don't have your guys' credentials. So I would love to see that drive the grouping more than an artistic. Leave the artistic to the design people that are either doing the project for the city, or if it's a private development, let it be the professional doing it. And then lastly, and Greg Rubin's not here today, but this is the one thing he was beating into my head about the fungal structure of native areas. And again, not my expertise, you know, if it's electrical, I'm all over it. You guys tell, is there something to do with the actual fungal structure in a native area that would prevent other plants, weeds from growing? That's what I noticed in my native area in my backyard. So I would throw that out there. I think we didn't talk about that, and I think that's an important thing to the longevity of the native plants once they are planted.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Any quick comments on anything that was said here tonight? Yes, Katie?
I just wanted to let the gentleman know that the first meeting that we had a presentation that outlined the justifications and reasons for working on such an policy. So we didn't really get into the background tonight. This is our third meeting. But the first meeting, which was recorded, and there's a PowerPoint presentation that you'll be able to access, does provide all the background justification.
So where would I find that? Because I'm interested,
City
I'm
website,
interested to see
yeah.
what the language is on that.
Go ahead and contact Jennifer Gates here. Is that what you were saying? And she can make sure you can, so she'll share her information with you.
Easiest way is city website, search native plant ordinance. It'll take you to one of the top hits of the page. Where you can find most of the stuff. That's how I find it.
And also share information in case.
Yeah, I don't, I would email me, because I need to double check that the actual PowerPoint is on.
Yeah, I didn't
The
see it.
actual,
Yeah.
the recorded version is on.
I
So,
think it is on, I saw it, but maybe it's hard to find.
yeah, it's not the easiest to find, because it doesn't have its own web page.
Well, can't somebody on this brain trust here in 1 or 2 sentences tell me the justification since it's already apparently been memorialized?
Maybe I could talk to you after, because I'm really wrapping up for today. And I appreciate your question though, and I really will respond to you. I appreciate that everyone came through these 3 meetings, and it's been such a great opportunity for good input that we really need. It's good expertise, and we worked well together. And now the next steps are for Jennifer to kind of, I'll work with Jennifer to kind of craft this into the next steps. Do you want to just say 2, 3 words on the next steps from this point?
Sure, so the next steps at this point would be that Councilmember Lyons and Hindy would present to City Council what this group learned from each other and how they want to move forward. Basically what you guys have discussed in the longer document, but would be like an attachment, but maybe the shorter version would be the summary would be in the staff report of, and then asking City Council to provide direction, because right now it's not actually in staff work programs and there's no budget associated. So depending on what the final recommendation is or direction from City Council, there may be additional direction to come back with a budget to implement and things like that, because we do have, Chris on staff as the arborist, but then there may be other resources at DUDEC that maybe could help refine what this actually looks like. Definitely not my expertise.
It will come back, so it'll go to the City Council, and then after that, it will come back to the commissions.
Yeah, so they'll provide direction if that's the way the council wants to do, to initiate an actual ordinance or policy. And then we would circulate it amongst all the commissions through your different secretaries. And then also Parks, who I failed to invite at the very beginning of this, but it will go to Parks as well. And then we'll come back, finalize it with Planning Commission for their recommendation as required by our ordinance and by our code, and then go back to City Council. The other aspect of this is that it would probably need to go to Coastal Commission for their final approval.
So as you can tell by the process that she's outlined, there'll be a lot of opportunity for public comment. So we're just starting this, and I think we're starting it in a really good way. So thanks for your help and for your interest in this. Appreciate it. Go ahead and adjourn us.